Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and it's still Arnhem Week. Christopher Jary from the Keep Museum and author of multiple books about the British Army, in particular regiments local to him, returns to the channel to talk about the Dorsets and the battalions of the Dorset Regiment and individuals of the Dorsetshire Regiment in Market Garden 80 years ago, which was all kicking off. It is 80 years ago to the day. It was all beginning. So I'm going to bring him in now. Good afternoon, Christopher. How are you today?
Hello. Very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. So I know what you're going to answer to this question there, but the focus for the anniversary is always about the paratroopers and the gliders. Do you think that the ground part of this operation is overlooked in terms of commemoration and remembrance?
Yes. Simple as that. Yes. I can see why it's happened. You know, the really exciting, interesting bit, the bit where so many men were lost, was Airborne. But actually the 30 Corps bit of it was a really important part of the story. And that's the one I'm going to bang on about today.
And as we learned from Roger Sewell and others, it had started the ground operation days, if not weeks earlier, because they're racing across to get themselves in place for whatever is going to be proposed as the next stage. And I'm sure commanders were hearing different rumors and different ideas as the Allies were on the brink of doing something pretty extraordinary or attempting to do something pretty extraordinary. So, you know, and of course they've been on the ground all that time, whereas the Airborne, although they're training and they're honing to a sharp edge, they are in England, whereas the ground elements had been pushing their way up over weeks, months, and years, depending on the unit. But anyway, you have come, as always, armed with a PowerPoint. Folks, fire away with questions for Christopher and what have you, but we're going to basically cover these various separate stories, all connected to Christopher's interest and his voluntary work at the museum down there. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Now, here's the Dorset badge. It's a nice shiny one. We're very proud of it. We're very proud of the Dorsets. But let's just be clear. There were lots of other regiments involved in this. There was the whole of the 50th Division. There was the whole of the 43rd Division. You know, there was the Guards Armored Division. And we mustn't forget 1st Airborne if we're looking at the Americans for the Airborne part of it. So I'm not saying rah, 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 the Dorsets won their part of the Battle of Arnhem. What I am saying is what they did was, I think, unique in that they had 4 fighting battalions in the Second World War and 3 of them were at Arnhem.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking about those. I'm also going to throw in another aspect to it, which is the Dorset Yeomanry, who were also there fighting as gunners, and they were jolly good gunners. So I'm going to tell you about them as well. So 4 different units that we're going to be talking about. The bit, of course, that most people know about is pictured in this Airborne pennant. Now, this was given by Boyd Browning, the Corps commander at Arnhem, who was very grateful, as the Airborne forces were, for what the 4th Dorsets, and you can see the number under the badge there, that's the 4th Battalion of the Dorsets, their territorial battalion, did when they went over the Neder Rijn and helped to rescue a lot of airborne people back across the river. That is a fabulous and very sad story. It was the destruction of the 4th Battalion, and I will be talking about that, but I'll also be talking about the other battalions who did all sorts of other things. One point that I would make about the 4th Battalion is that they were the only non-airborne infantry battalion to receive the battle honour at Arnhem. And I think this is the only pennant that was awarded to anyone. So it's rather a nice thing to have. And if you want to see it, come and see us at the Keep Military Museum, because it's on display there.
Oh, good plug, sir.
Okay. A good plug. Absolutely. Get in early. Right. Let's have a look at the map. Let's just remind ourselves what Arnhem's about for those of us who haven't been following this week. Right now, of course, if we go back 80 years, a couple of hours ago, the Airborne would have been landing on their dropping zones. And about an hour ago, 30 Corps will have kicked off. In fact, what happened was that the leading troop commander of Joe Vandeleur's Irish Guards group will have said driver advance. So that happened about an hour ago, 80 years ago. And they're down in the bottom of that map, just above where it says Second Army. You can see 30 Corps there in the middle, XXX, and the arrow pointing up that road. And it's rather a long road. It's 60 miles, and it goes all the way up to Arnhem, through Valkenswaard, which is the first important place there, Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and then up to Arnhem. The bit between Nijmegen and Arnhem we will be concentrating on a lot later on. That's where there was very fierce fighting. You will know that I'm talking about that because that is known as the island, because it's so flat and it's cut off between these two rivers. So we'll be coming back to that. Now, the plan, as we all know, was for 3 airborne divisions, 2 American and 1 British, to capture crossings over waterways between the south, where the advance starts, and Arnhem. You've got the 101st Airborne Division in that first block. Then you've got the 82nd under Jim Gavin, and then you've got the 1st British Airborne Division at Arnhem Bridge, which is the ultimate prize. That is the one that's going to give them access across the Neder Rijn. And the idea then is to get across that bridge with armor and to isolate the Ruhr. Once you've isolated the Ruhr, that's the end of the German industry and the end of the Germans in the war. So these are big stakes we're talking about here. This was an opportunity to end the war in 1944. Had it succeeded, the map of post-war Europe would have looked very different. Russia wouldn't have owned half as much of Germany as it ended up owning. A lot of people who died subsequently, including Anne Frank in the concentration camps, who died in February 1945, they wouldn't have died. A lot of British infantry and armor casualties and the American casualties getting across the Rhine and across Germany right to the end. The casualties were pretty nasty. There were some nasty battles. So all of that, none of that would have happened, and it would have been over by Christmas. So this was a fabulous thing. Now, was it a reasonable...
Just a quick comment from me, Christopher, and it's basically, on this channel, we look at a lot of military operations that are overly complicated, lots of moving parts, lots of things that have to go in sequence and in combination. If there's one good thing we can say about the Market Garden Plan, especially in terms of 30 Corps, is it is fairly simple. Now, the execution of it, I would grant, is a lot more complicated, but head up a single road and get to the troops who've landed by parachute and glider near those bridges. It's not, you know, in terms of the simplicity of it, there's nothing to fault. You know, the passing of the information down from general down to platoon commanders, you know, it's an easy one, isn't it, in that sense?
Yes, but. And the but is that getting up that road, it's flat country either side. It's one line of advance. It's a very, very dangerous proposition. You've got Germans either side. They can cut the road at any point. When they do, you can't get ammunition or supplies up. And it, you know, it's a very risky strategy, actually.
Oh, I didn't say it wasn't risky. I said it was simple. and people have already leapt back at me and going, sure, Woody. Yeah. But I'm just in terms of, you know, to being fair to how we process and analyze battles, there are some that are very, very complicated that actually work very well. This one, as we know, doesn't work very well, but it's got a simplicity to it, even though it is incredibly high risk.
Then I agree entirely on that. On that basis, I agree. As far as the landings of the Airborne Division, particularly the 1st Airborne Division, not a good place to land them. Far too far from the target, which was Arnhem Bridge. It was 8 to 10 miles away, and that's too far. There would, as far as the plan is concerned, I think there were just too many parts of it that could go wrong, and then did go wrong. Yeah. That's the basic problem. It strikes me as a right idea carried out in the wrong way, just too late. If it had happened earlier, you might have got away with it, and that would have been a fabulous story to tell, wouldn't it?
Yep.
Now, what I plan to do, if it's okay with you, is to tell you about, first of all, about 2 Dorsets, who were not fighting in those units, because they did play quite an important part. And the first one is our next gentleman, who's going to come bobbing up here. He appears in the film. They call him Fuller in the film, but actually his real name was Urquhart. And that's why they had to change it for A Bridge Too Far, because you'd have had two Urquharts and people would have got confused. But this actually is Brian Urquhart, who was a brain on legs. I mean, an extraordinarily clever young man, and a brilliant staff officer. The reason he was a staff officer was he'd had a parachuting accident and was injured, and he was on the staff of Boy Browning. And what he said to Boy, what happened with him, I'll read you what Brian Urquhart wrote about it. My job as chief intelligence officer was to try to evaluate what the enemy reactions were going to be and how our troops ought to deal with them. I became increasingly alarmed because there were intelligence reports that there were 2 SS Panzer divisions right next to where the British troops were to be dropped. I was also worried about the state of mind of the senior officers in my outfit, who were all extremely gung-ho and were talking about Christmas in Berlin. If we were going to do it properly, we were going to have to drop the troops in a different place so they could immediately capture the bridge. And there was a big question as to whether the relieving troops could get up from near Brussels in time. The roads are all causeways. They're perfect roads for an armoured force to stop another force from advancing. Our general, a very dashing figure called Boy Browning, said to Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands that the Allied forces were going to advance into Germany over a carpet of airborne troops. And I said to our chief of staff, I wonder if they're going to be alive or dead airborne troops. This didn't go well at all, and everyone decided they'd had enough, and I got sent away. So that's what happened to Brian Urquhart. It's an important warning early on. Incidentally, just before we leave Brian, Sir Brian, as he became, actually,
Yep.
I'd just like to tell you that 3 or 4 years ago, I had, within a couple of weeks of each other, 2 Miss Urquharts come to see me. One was Brian's daughter, and he was still alive. He was 100, living in America. And we were able to send him for his 100th birthday a copy of the regimental history, which was very nice. And then a couple of weeks later, I had Judy Urquhart, who is Roy Urquhart's daughter,
Wow.
who was coming to see me about when Roy Urquhart commanded 231 Brigade on Sicily. So we were honoured by these Urquharts. If we move forward, we can have a look at Brian Urquhart. There he is. That's what he became, Sir Brian. And the sign up there's a clue. He spent his career in the United Nations doing a lot of good. So he made good. They also mentioned him dispatches and gave him an MBE for his work after Arnhem. So he wasn't ostracized or punished in any way. And history, I suspect, has proved him right.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So that's Brian Urquhart. Let's come back to the map. And what I'm going to do is look at the various stages of the battle. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the 1st Airborne Division landings, the British ones, up at the top round Arnhem there. And they were actually happening 80 years ago as we speak. The next thing I'm going to do is to look at the 30 Corps advance going up that road. That involved the 1st Dorsets in 231 Brigade in the initial part of it. It then included the 43rd Wessex Division passing through and crossing the bridge at Nijmegen after its capture and moving up to the Neder Rijn. So we'll be dealing with that. I'll also be touching on the Dorset Yeomanry, who as 94th Field Regiment were supporting 129 Brigade of the 43rd Wessex Division around Elst. Don't need to remember all this. I will be coming to it time by time, but I'd just like you to understand what the menu is for today. And finally, the 1st Dorsets really put the whole battle to bed by seeing the Germans off and preventing them taking Nijmegen again by at a battle in early October 1944. And that will be the end of it. So there are 4 different stages of this as we go through. Gives you hope if you can see these stages going past.
Oh, we're loving it, Christopher.
Now, this is a a sad story. I'm sorry to start with a sad story, but it is a sad story. This is Lieutenant Raymond Bussell. He was commissioned into the Dorset Regiment in the mid-1930s, I think about 1936 or 7. And during Arnhem, he was attached to the 3rd Parachute Battalion. So he dropped in the brigade whose job was going to be to take the bridge at Arnhem. And he dropped on the 17th, so that's 80 years ago today, and he was wounded round about tea time, so in about a couple of hours' time. He was very badly wounded in the arm, several shots in the arm, suggests a machine gun. He was whipped off to the regimental aid post, and then finally was moved to Oosterbeek, to the hospital there. He was captured when that was captured by the Germans. He was put on a train, and on the train he was, quite a courageous chap. He jumped off the train, though wounded, and tried to make his escape. He was on the run for, I think, a day or two, and then was captured. He was informed on by a Dutch informer who handed him over to a German policeman with the Sicherheitsdienst, who shot him in the back with another soldier, and was later tried by the Dutch court after the war and shot himself. He'd murdered about 50 people in the way that he murdered Raymond Bussell. Quite unnecessary. Goodness knows why he did it. Just a nasty type of person. But a very sad story. And he was murdered on the 2nd of October. So before Arnhem really ground to a halt. But what a brave man to try to do that escape.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so that's Raymond Bussell. Of course, what we have to remember is that of the parachute brigade that he was part of, only one battalion managed to reach Arnhem Bridge. 1 para and 3 para didn't make it through. They did their best, but they didn't make it. 2 para were either lucky or perhaps more experienced than the others. They were certainly lucky in their commanding officer. John Frost was a go-getter, and he led them to the bridge, and he grabbed the bridge. And so we were left with Arnhem Bridge in the hands of 2 para under John Frost's excellent command. But it was a precarious position to be in. He was going to have to hold for at least 2 days and possibly 4. That was his brief. So we'll leave him there, and we'll look back at 30 Corps, and who better to start with than this gentleman with his toothy grin. This is Brian Horrocks, for whom I have immense respect. When I was writing, say, Red a Road, 2 stories shot out at me, both from Dorset soldiers. One was when Horrocks first took over around Montpinçon. He was walking past a couple of Dorsets, and one of them said, "Any gen, sir?" Didn't know how. He knew he was a senior officer, but he didn't know how senior. Anyway, this corps commander, who'd just arrived in Normandy, borrowed the company commander's map, gathered the soldiers around him, and gave them a briefing, not just on what their part of the battle was, but on what Patton was doing further down the line. And they went away hugely impressed. After Arnhem, during the battle at Clave, when they were trying to get down through the Reichswald forest to places like Xanten to clear the west bank of the Rhine, Sergeant Ginger Pierce of the Dorset Regiment found himself broken down in his Bren gun carrier at the side of the road, and a jeep going past screeched to a halt, and out got Brian Horrocks, who said, "What are you up to?" And they said, "Well, we've broken down, sir." So he first of all arranged food for them. He then got their jeep mended, and he then said to them, "I'm about to start my battle with your lot in a day's time. I want you 2 there." So he said, "This is where you need to be," and he showed them on the map. And of course, as they left him, they were walking 12 feet tall, because a lieutenant general with goodness knows how many divisions under his command had just told them that he wanted them in his battle. So that was the sort of leadership that Horrocks provided, and he has my vote.
I still think he's one of the standout interviewees in A World at War. I mean, there are some amazing characters in A World at War, but Horrocks and everything he did lots of at a British Army of the Rhine lectures and staff ride stuff. I always think he just came across very, very well.
Absolutely. You're not old enough to remember this, but he used to do talks to camera, and before those, and he was absolutely terrific. He really was. Okay, so next picture, if we may. Now here we have, he doesn't look that much like Michael Caine, but of course Michael Caine was the guy who played him in the film. This is Joe Vandeleur. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Irish Guards, a humorist, and another leader like Horrocks. A very good man to be leading the Irish Guards group forward and to spearhead this particular advance. If anyone could do it, Joe was probably the guy who was going to do it, and he certainly gave it his best. Below him in the command setup, we have Speedy Breeden, and he's just about to appear. And there he is. He's the guy with the highly polished badge on his beret and the military cross ribbon. This is actually just after he's done what I'm telling you about now, because what he has to do, the Devons, the 2nd Devons and the 1st Dorsets have to clear the woods either side and support the Irish Guards, Joe Vandeleur, as they come up the road from Eindhoven to Varseveld. And this is after he's got to Varseveld, and he's actually talking to a chap in the Dutch resistance here and discussing what's going on and where the Germans are around there. And that's his second in command there, Peter Brind, who later became a general. Okay, so that's Breeden. Breeden, if we can go on one, this is Varseveld. This is where they had to go when they set out from Eindhoven. You had the Devons initially supporting Joe Vandeleur's tanks, and they were riding on the tanks as they went. It was not an easy start to the operation. I looked up this morning to see how many Devons were killed on that first day as they started pushing up the road towards Varseveld here. And there were 11 Devons killed, and there were 19 Irish Guardsmen killed. These were tanks being knocked out and Devons either being beside them or riding on them, or maybe being killed in the woods, clearing those woods. So this early breaking through the crust of the German resistance was actually a difficult task. Breeden was known as Speedy in the regiment because actually he was always late for everything. So it was ironic. But in fact, on this occasion, he was desperate to be speedy. He wanted to get on up that road, and his brigadier, Alex Stanier, stopped him and said he couldn't move up to Valkenswaard until after the 90th Field Regiment had come up. Otherwise, there'd be nobody there to protect them if the Germans attacked the road. And Speedy Breeden was champing at the bit and arguing the toss, and finally managed to get an agreement from the brigadier that he could take Varseveld at first light, which he did. And here is Varseveld with a colossal traffic jam going through. Here is another problem with this advance. There's traffic jams everywhere because the vehicles were often 3 abreast going up that road. Okay, let's go back, have a look at the map again. And what this is a map of the bit from Nijmegen up to Arnhem. So you've got Nijmegen down in the south there, and you've got Arnhem up at the top. To the left of Arnhem, you've got the Oosterbeek perimeter, which is where the Airborne eventually found themselves completely trapped and surrounded by Germans, except for John Frost's battalion, who were on the bridge at Arnhem. 43rd Wessex Division had to fight their way through the traffic jams coming up to Nijmegen. They finally reached Nijmegen on the 20th of September, which was the day the bridge was captured. Now, if you remember the film, the bridge was captured by Robert Redford, who was playing Julian Cook, who was the company commander who went across from 82nd Airborne Division, fantastically brave, across the river under fire in storm boats in order to capture the far end of the bridge. And nothing anybody says can negate what Julian Cook and his men did. It was a colossally brave thing to do. But there were other people involved in this operation. On the bridge was Lord Peter Carrington and his troop of Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armoured Grenadier Guards Battalion. And there they are. And there they are on Nijmegen Bridge. I don't think this was probably taken during the battle, but you get the idea. I looked out this morning, which I never looked at it before, and I should have done, Carrington's Military Cross citation for this. So if anybody's in any doubt about this, and the Times apparently were in doubt about it this week when they reviewed Al Murray's book, because they announced that it was captured entirely by the 82nd Airborne Division. If anyone's in any doubt about it, on the 20th of September, this officer was ordered to guide a troop of tanks down to Nijmegen Bridge and then to push them across with a view to capturing the bridge intact. The troop duly attacked, captured the bridge, and then pushed on up the main road on the far side for some distance to consolidate their gain. Hearing that the enemy had infiltrated between the troop and the bridge, this officer, on his own initiative, crossed the bridge again in his tank and engaged the enemy, driving them off and remaining holding the far side of the bridge until relieved by another tank. He then proceeded up the road and joined the troop holding the central line. So actually, who captured the bridge? Well, they all did. And isn't that nice? But let's not forget the Grenadier Guards and Peter Carrington. It was a very brave thing. Now, I'm just going to tell you about one person that I met actually on that bridge, and his name was Jim Mitchell. And he was the squadron sergeant major of Peter Carrington's squadron. And he was a remarkable man. He became Regimental Sergeant Major Jim Mitchell, DCM, and he won his DCM at Dunkirk. He was tall and diffident and rather thin and very elderly when I met him. And when we were on that bridge, it was freezing cold, and he was telling us about what they'd done. And it was absolutely fascinating. But I was very worried about Jim because he turned blue and he was an old man. And I thought we're going to take back fewer people on this trip than we brought out if we're not careful. So when I got him back to the hotel, I got him a horse's neck, a brandy with ginger ale in. And I ordered him, a brave thing to do to order a guard sergeant major, I ordered him to go and get a hot bath. And half an hour later, to my immense relief, Jim Mitchell came back and he turned no longer blue. He was now lovely and pink and back to his old self. So we didn't lose him, but he nearly lost his life for a second time on Nijmegen Bridge, in my view. A great man. Peter Carrington's Troop Sergeant Major at one point. Okay, so that's the bridge. Let's come back to now this is the crossing. Could we just go back to the map to before? Thank you very much. What the 4th Dorsets had to do at this point, let's just consider what the 43rd Wessex Division were doing. They came through Nijmegen, which was full of cheering crowds and all sorts of blockages and things that had to be cleared up, and they got across the bridge. The Irish Guards had already tried to get up the road from Nijmegen to Arnhem, and they'd lost a lot of tanks. And the reason they'd lost a lot of tanks was that the whole situation had now changed. John Frost had bravely held on the bridge at Arnhem until the morning of the 21st of September, but finally he had to surrender. Immediately he surrendered and Arnhem Bridge was open. The Germans poured tanks, infantry, 88s over that bridge, and they produced a screen north of Elst, right the way across, to block any advance up towards the Neder Rijn. At this moment, the battle was pretty much lost. There was one obvious question: could they get up the road to the Neder Rijn, break through those German defences, and see if they could get across the Neder Rijn to reinforce the airborne, not John Frost, but the rest of them, in the Oosterbeek perimeter there, who were being squeezed by the German forces. So this was the question: could they do that? Cometh the moment, cometh the man, and the man who tried to do this. Sorry, could we just stay on the map for the moment?
I'm sorry, I was trying to skip ahead.
You're dead keen, Paul, but it's
so excited.
Irony is not lost on me. Right. Cometh the moment, cometh the man, and the guy to do this was a fellow called George Taylor, who wrote a very good book called Battalion Commander. And if you haven't,
brilliant book.
If you haven't read it, read it. It's the second best book by a battalion commander in the Second World War.
I've got a signed copy by Colonel Taylor.
I hate you. Okay, and what George Taylor did, and he was what in those days was known as a thruster. He took his battalion straight up that road where it says 214 Brigade, right up to where it says 7 Hampshire, and he burst into Driel up there where it says 5 Dorsets, hitting a leading tank, hit a mine as it went in. There was a colossal bang, but he'd actually broken right through the Germans' positions and got up to the river. And at that stage, the brigade commander of 130 Brigade, Ben Walton, decided that the thing to do was to send the whole of his brigade right up there after him, which he did. And a column was formed of the 4th Dorsets, the 5th Dorsets, and the 7th Hampshires, who together made up 130 Brigade, and it broke through up there. They met some Tiger tanks round about Elst, but I'm sure they had some losses, but they actually got through and they got up to the river. So the question now was, could they get over the Rhine, the Neder Rijn there, in order to support and reinforce the airborne? And the 4th Dorsets were ordered to do that. If we could move on now to the picture of Driel, this is where the 4th Dorsets actually did try to cross the river. And what you've got here, it's the old site of a ferry that used to go across at Driel. And there's some high ground there, which I can't pronounce, but I think it's Westerboing Heights.
Westerboing, yeah.
Westerboing Heights, yeah.
What a fantastic restaurant as well.
No, I haven't been to that. It's good, is it?
Yeah. When it's open, I end up arriving there when it's just closed, or it's the week of their vacation or something like that. But yeah, great place with a great view. Yeah. You can see where the ferry was, and lovely place. I wish I was there now.
Time spent in Holland is seldom wasted.
Indeed.
Right, now, what comes next is an episodic story. So I'm just going to tell it in sort of photographs, really, with a description of who these people are. But this is where they had to cross. They crossed in darkness on the night of the 25th of September, and their remit, as they were about to set off, was supposed to be to reinforce the airborne. By the time they actually did set off, their commanding officer, George Tilley, had been told that their orders had changed. Miles Dempsey, had persuaded Horrocks, who was dead keen to give this a whirl and just see if they could pull success out of the bag. Dempsey had said, no, it's not going to work. What we'll use the 4th Dorsets for is to bring the airborne out. So the Dorsets went over there, and their job was to rescue the airborne. Okay, now this guy in the middle there with his hands in his pockets is Jimmy Grafton. He was company commander in the Dorsets. Later on, he owned a pub in London. And it was in his pub that his friends, Michael Benteen, Harry Seacombe, Peter Sellers, and Spike Milligan, got together and formed the Goons. So actually, this Jimmy Grafton played an important part in post-war popular comedy. For the moment, what he was doing wasn't funny at all. He had a message for Urquhart, and it was Roy Urquhart, his job personally to deliver it to 1st Airborne headquarters and make sure that Urquhart knew that there was now an evacuation happening and they wanted him to do X by whatever time it was to be ready to come off on the boats. So he succeeded. He managed to get across the river. Both the gunner officers who went across with him were wounded, and one of them died of his wounds. But Jimmy Grafton actually got through and saw Urquhart and was able to deliver the message, and he got back. So he did extremely well. The next person we're looking at is Private Alec Taylor. Alec Taylor was 20 and a new recruit to the army. And he confided, as they went across in the boats, to the chap next to him that he was Jewish and that he did not want to be captured. He would rather die. Sadly, he got his wish. Okay, on to the next one. The chap on the left here, looking rather more earnest and less self-confident than the one on the right, is Major Philip Roper. He was a pre-war solicitor in Bridport in the Territorial Army, and he was a very brave man. He was commanding a company, and before he went, this is what he went down to have a look across the river before he set off, and he wrote, "We could see everything up to the trees which came down to the edge of the river on the north bank, but nothing on the trees on the ground which sloped steeply up from the river." So they didn't know what was in those trees. Colonel Tilley said, "Gentlemen, we've bought it this time." I think he realized it was a pretty hairy operation. As for myself, I thought it unlikely we'd get back. When I had my Company O group, I tried to water it down as much as possible and told them we were going to do an important job to help the airborne people. And so he set off with that in mind. Now, as they crossed the river, of course, the boats were often holed by machine gun fire from the opposite bank. They were often mortared as they crossed. A lot of people were washed downstream. Some people were killed and washed downstream. And they landed strung out along the opposite bank in the dark, not knowing where each other were. It was complete chaos. Roper managed to collect a fair number of his soldiers together, nothing like a company strength. We're talking about 20 or 30 people maximum here. Lieutenant Colonel Tilley was doing exactly the same thing until a German lobbed a grenade at him, and then he was knocked unconscious. Roper dug in, and when Tilley regained consciousness, he found Roper and joined his party. So there was one reasonable sized party of Dorsets dug in on the bank there, trying to defend it. There were others wandering about, little parties trying to do things, and that's how they spent the night. Honestly, it was just chaotic.
And it's just worth mentioning, Christopher, how little training an infantry battalion would have had for the complicated nature of a kind of a push across a river to mount. You're not kind of mounting a bridgehead. It's partly a rescue operation. It's partly a reconnaissance operation. It's partly this is where my hopes for the Market Garden plan and my kind of belief it could have worked start crumbling apart at things like this. It's not just the ability to get bridging equipment and all that kind of stuff. It's just the high risk of doing this kind of stuff. I mean, this is not a little stream you're just whacking across. This is 400-meter wide river with Germans all over the bloody place on the other side, and how you're meant to kind of unravel this plan and make it work with all the confusion going on around it. This is where I start getting angry, and I don't know who I'm angry at. It's not you, by the way, but just the way this plan kind of falls apart at these kind of things, despite incredible bravery.
I mean, I think you're right. And I think had it been left to Dempsey, probably the Dorsets wouldn't have gone across. This was Horrocks' idea. Horrocks was an enthusiast. He was determined, like George Taylor. He was a thruster. He wanted to get across that river and see if he could pull the thing out of the fire, but he couldn't. And actually, I think it was pretty clear. I think you're right. It's pretty clear you couldn't have done it at that stage. And so the 4th Dorsets effectively were sacrificed, and I suspect unnecessarily. They were able to help some airborne back. There were people passed through them. Some of the 4th Dorsets themselves got back, but it was a chaotic evacuation. We'll come back to that in just a moment. If we move on to the next picture. Now, this is a very nice man who I remember well. His name was Cliff Lloyd, and he died in his mid-90s, only 2 or 3 years ago. And he was when he was a pre-war territorial. He was from Gillingham in Dorset, and when he was actually told he was going to he'd been called up for the war, he was serving cheese in the international stores in Gillingham. He was just cutting some cheese, and he set off to war. He was wounded in his first action, which was Hill 112, which many of you will know about already, but is something that I think we ought to talk about at some point, because it's a fantastic story in itself. The 4th Dorsets were wiped out at Hill 112 in July, on the 10th of July, 1944. Cliff was wounded and evacuated to England. He'd just arrived back, and now he's been sent over the river. He was very clear that when Colonel Tilley ordered the Dorsets to surrender, he saved their lives. And this is what Cliff said. It was obvious that we were surrounded by German troops. The commanding officer's order, Dorset ceasefire, saved my life along with many others. But of course, they went into imprisonment. 150 of them were captured. And Cliff was one of those. And what he said about that, subsequent imprisonment in a prisoner of war camp was a different situation again. Prisoners were not subjected to the ill treatment suffered by POWs in Japanese camps, but life was difficult at times and possible death wasn't far away. There was only one meager food ration daily. When I became ill from an infection in my hand and refused to work, the guard put a round in his rifle. So these poor men spent 8 months as prisoners of war as a result of this, and 11 of them did not survive that imprisonment. Many of them, frankly, because of Allied bombing, incidentally, rather than anything the Germans did. Okay, let's move on to the next chap. This is a great bloke, Mac McDermott. He served in 3 regiments. He was really a Royal Fusilier, but on D-Day he landed as a Bedford and Hertfordshire, actually on the beach, and did all that stuff in the one of those blocks, a brick that they had to create to set up the defences there. And then when that was dissolved, he was sent to the Dorsets, and he went over with his men, dug in separately, just a small group of them. He managed to get them out, and he swam back across the river because there wasn't room in the boat for him. His men went in the boat, he swam beside them. And then the next day, when they were looking for more 4th Dorsets, he swam back across the river to find them. He didn't find any. He couldn't find anyone at all. And if we could go through the next picture, this is Henry Hall. His name wasn't really Henry, but there was a band leader then, so that was his nickname. And he did exactly the same thing. He tried to get over the river, failed, but the next day swam over to see if he could find any Dorsets and swam back again. Both McDermott and Hall were given the Military Cross, and my goodness, they earned it. Okay, next picture. This is another company commander, who got over the river. This is Mike Whittle. When he came back, he did the same as Mac McDermott. There weren't enough places in the boat, so he swam and his men went in the boat. When he got back, he reported to the brigadier, Ben Walton, and Ben Walton congratulated him and congratulated Henry Hall, who was also there, on what they'd done, and said, I'm going to recommend you both for the Military Cross. And then in came General Butch Thomas, who was the divisional commander of 43rd Wessex Division. And he said, Whittle ought to be court-martialed for having left his post the other side. He's not getting a Military Cross. Whittle didn't get his Military Cross, but the Dutch gave him an award instead. But he did survive and lived very happily in Dorset for a very long time afterwards. So this is I actually make no apology for the fact that this is all over the place, this part of the story.
We don't care. We're loving it. It's riffing. It's freestyle jazz. It's great. Yeah.
But that's that's what's happening. It's a mess. And there are other things that I could add to it, but I won't at the moment. The big picture is that 289 members of the 4th Dorsets actually made it across the river to the Arnhem, to the Oosterbeek side. 122 came back. 150 were prisoners of war. Only 17 were killed. And 11 died as prisoners of war. So essentially 28 losses as a result of this battalion, but huge number in prisoner of war camps. Okay, let's move on to the map. And what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about the role of the other Dorset battalion there, the 5th Dorsets. And if you look up at the top there at Driel, under the Oosterbeek thing below the river, you'll see 5 Dorsets. That's where they were. This, once Arnhem Bridge had fallen, became a very, very dangerous place to be, because it meant that the Germans were constantly attacking them. And there were a lot of very unpleasant battles with the 7th Hampshires and the 5th Dorsets. 7th Hampshires had Germans coming across the river at them, where they were. 5th Dorsets had them coming under the railway bridge and attacking them there, and coming off the bank and attacking them. So it was a really, really unpleasant place to be. During the actual evacuation, the 5th Dorsets played quite an important part anyway. So if we move on to the next picture, here is a hero. Heroes, that's what heroes look like. This is Bob Wriggler. Bob Wriggler was the pioneer sergeant of the 5th Dorsets, and he was in charge of the boats that went over to rescue the Airborne, and he was bringing people back the entire time. He was decorated by us with a mention in dispatches, which was a bit mean, I think. He was given a Dutch award, and latterly, and that's what he's wearing in this picture because he's just been awarded it, there he is with his Légion d'honneur that the French gave him late in life. Still a proud Dorset, still wearing his badge, properly polished, and wearing his regimental tie. What more could you ask? Great man.
Indeed.
Okay, so that's Bob Wriggler, and here's evidence of what the 5th Dorsets got up to, because they knocked out that Panther. I'm not quite sure what with, but there it was, and it came and attacked them, so they got it. All sorts of very unpleasant battles around, and of course these spread further. So if we could have a quick look at the map, which comes next.
Nope, hang on, we're going to go back one.
No. I'm very happy to do. I'm quite happy. Okay. We'll do this one. This is the 5th Dorset's medical officer, Paddy Blair. He's the guy in the white overall thing, apron. And this is inside Driel School, which was the advanced dressing station. And he did a lot of work there because there were a lot of airborne wounded coming across. There were a lot of 4th Dorsets coming back. There were 5th Dorsets and 7th Hampshires being wounded all around him. There were wounded Germans, and Paddy Blair earned his money here, as he had done in Normandy. There's a picture of him. Some of you may have seen it front page picture post. He's wearing a tin hat and he's wearing a Dorset shoulder flash, and he looks absolutely shattered. Absolutely shattered. The price of battlefield medicine to people who did their best.
I'm going to give a plug for a show I only listed this morning. Tomorrow on World War II TV in the evening, Professor John Tregonning is coming on to talk about the medics at Arnhem, but he is a researcher into infectious disease. That's his day job. So particularly about infection, penicillin, that kind of aspect. We've done talks in the past about the use of medic, but this is someone who absolutely understands the danger of the infection aspect of it. So I'm really looking forward to the professor's talk tomorrow. That's tomorrow on World War II TV. Back to you, Christopher. I've did my plug now.
Well, that'd be really, really interesting. I mean, one of the things that came out when I was writing the book about Sicily, that was the first time they'd used drips. And one of the Dorset officers there saw a drip and didn't know what it was. And Martin Herford, who you'll be hearing from about tomorrow, because he was an incredibly brave RAMC doctor who was at Arnhem as well. He was there in Italy. And of course, penicillin was coming in at that point.
Yeah.
And the guy who saw the drips was there because he'd been very badly wounded, and they sorted out the infection with the new penicillin for him. So it was all of this from 1943 onwards was beginning to change. Okay, let's have a look at the map.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Right, that's enough about 130 Brigade. I now want to talk to you about the Dorset Yeomanry. And the Dorset Yeomanry supported another brigade in 43rd Wessex Division. It was 129 Brigade, and 129 Brigade consisted of the 4th Somerset Light Infantry and the 4th Wiltshires and the 5th Wiltshires. And you can see where they were, while the 7th Hampshires and the 5th Dorsets were up on the river, all around Elst. That's where they were. And right at the front in Elst for some of the time was my dad commanding 18 platoon of the 4th Somerset Light Infantry. He was supported in battle by the 94th Field Regiment, the Dorset Yeomanry, and he was a very, very satisfied customer indeed. Their OP in Elst was what we're going to see next. No, sorry, you're not going to see that next. We're going to see this is a Dorset Yeomanry 25-pounder, and the guy with the stripes, the gun commander, is actually Sergeant George Upshall of the Dorset Yeomanry, who was at Arnhem. And the thing that he remembered particularly about Arnhem was that their fire plan was 360 degrees. In other words, they had to be able to fire anywhere all the way around them. Now, how often does a gunner regiment get given an order like that, where the Germans could? It was an interesting reflection of the precarious position they were in, that they were expected their field gunners to be able to operate anywhere like that.
Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. And we had the comment from History Explorer. Rob is a serving major in the Royal Artillery, and just, that river crossing, you'd never plan that without full support of artillery and be able to bring on, whatever you want there with forward observers. And, some of the situations these units found themselves in, without the ability, or in this case, having to have a 360-degree, fire plan, absolutely, it gives us so much insight into where the operation is at this point.
Yeah. Anyway, there it is. That's the gun that won the war as well. The 25.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's spare a bit of love for the 25-pounder. Everybody, yes.
Our tanks were awful, but our field gun was magnificent. Look at that one. There we are.
Yeah,
right.
So now, good. Even the Americans used it in the Dirty Dozen. But anyway, yeah.
Let's look at their OP. This is Elst Church Tower. Now, how would you feel about going up that when you knew that it was being constantly shelled and that shells were actually coming through the body of the tower below you while you were directing fire from your guns that were probably about 3 miles away to the west? Not a happy position to be in. Now, their commanding officer, Thomas Bishel, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bishall, came over to Elst to meet the Brigadier Mole, for an O group. After the O group, he decided he was going to visit the FOO, the Forward Observation Officer, up that tower. And he chose the wrong moment because a shell landed, and that was the end of their CO. They lost their commanding officer here, which is sad because they didn't have very many casualties. They only had 6 casualties at Arnhem, and one of them was their commanding officer. Now, I think you've had enough military pictures, and I thought what I'd do now is show you a family snap instead. So here you are. Here's a picture of my parents' wedding in 1947. And I haven't gone completely mad because there is a reason for me showing you this. In fact, there are 2 reasons. The first one is it's the last picture of my father in uniform. There he is. He's the one in the middle. Okay. And the second one is because look who's standing next to him. And I don't mean my mum on his left. I mean his best man. And his best man is his forward observation officer from the 94th Field Regiment. And people who know about these things, if you're looking really closely at that, will see that Bramley Hancock, for that was his name, Bramley Hancock is wearing a Dorset Yeomanry tie for the occasion. This is a really good illustration of the closeness of the relationship between an infantry officer and an infantry platoon and the gunners who provide their forward observation teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is closer, actually, than it is the relationship is with other platoons in other companies of the same battalion. I remember Jim Kingston, my father's platoon sergeant, talking about Captain Dennis Clark, who was Bramley's the other forward observation officer, and Jim had all the prejudice of an infantry officer. You know, anyone who wasn't part of their platoon was a base waller. But he said of Captain Hancock, Dennis Clark, he said to me, Captain Clark was one of us. And there was no higher praise than that. And that meant he was up there, up the church tower, in the trenches with them, actually arranging all the support for them. And I want to just give you one illustration of this, which is actually from my father's book, and it takes place in Elst when he and his platoon were the forward platoon up in Elst, looking out over a dike. They held a forward position, and in front of them was a dike full of reeds. Some German troops had crept into the dike and had tried all sorts of things with Bren guns and grenades to chase them out of there, but they couldn't get the Germans out of this dike. He was at a loss what to do about it because they obviously posed a considerable danger to his platoon position. And this is what he said. I was saved by Captain Dennis Clark, MC, our tame gunner. Dennis had a virtuoso touch where 25-pounders were concerned. Sniping with one gun, that should get the buggers out, he said, with total confidence. Moving his 19 set into my platoon position, no easy task in daylight, he gave us a display of the most brilliant professionalism we had come to expect from the 94th Field Regiment. By firing with only one gun and making his mean point of impact beyond the dike containing the Germans, he slowly decreased the range yard by yard until one shell exploded in the dike. Out came 5 wet and very shaken Panzer Grenadiers. During this episode, all the platoon had to remain in the bottom of their slip trenches because Dennis's shells came over our positions with minimum clearance. I doubt if any experienced infantry officer would deny that the Royal Artillery during the Second World War were the most professionally competent people in the British Army. What a tribute.
See, now I wish I had some kind of round of applause I could pull up like a DJ, but I don't. But in my head, I have one. So if everyone watching at home now just does a round of applause, I'll do it there with a microphone. I think, yeah, my granddad was Royal Artillery for 6 years. So, huge affection for the regiment in our house.
Well, in 1993, I'd written a book about my mother's first husband, who was a bomber pilot, who was buried in Kiel in Germany. And nobody had ever been to his grave. So in 1993, I thought I would go. And I went over with my older daughter. And guess who we stayed with in Hamburg? Dennis Clark, who lived in Hamburg. So that relationship, nearly 40 years old then, no,
Wow.
nearly 50 years old then, they lent me their car. They looked after me. I stayed with his daughter in Lübeck afterwards. They were absolutely fantastic. And that's the closeness of the relationship.
Yeah.
He was a really nice man. He called me dear boy, and he called my daughter Leeds United because she was at Leeds Girls' School at that point. Right. Let us move on then. We'll leave the Dorset Yeomanry, only just to say that the Dorset Yeomanry, who I have a great admiration for, are very proud, and rightly so, of their First World War exploits as cavalry on the Libyan-Egyptian border, and then in Egypt and Palestine. They're right to be proud of that. I think they should be equally proud of the 94th Field Regiment, because they were superlative gunners. Let's move on to the last bit of the talk, which is, and I will call in the people who began it all. Do you remember the first Dorsets with Speedy Breeden? We're going up the road to Varseveld. That was the very first day of the operation, where we now come to the end of the operation, and 50 Div have been moved in to be beside 43rd Division. They're around the bottom of that north arrow on that map there. That's where they come onto the island here between Nijmegen and Arnhem. The problem here is that the Germans are trying to push down to retake Nijmegen. There's pressure all the time on them. It's and the British are dug in there in trenches. So it's almost First World War style. This, anybody who raises their head, there are machine guns, or Spandau's trains, and you've got also 88s knocking out any vehicle of any sort that appears. So it's a really dangerous place to be. They need to be driven back once and for all, and the 50 Division decide that they're going to put in an attack. And the attack's going to be led by the 1st Dorsets under Speedy Breeden. And these are people, we've talked about them before. They were on Malta. They were on Sicily. They then landed on the toe of Italy. They were then, with the Hampshires on their right, the first British infantry to land on the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June. And they fought all the way there, from there to here. They're very, very experienced troops now, those who have survived. One of those who've survived, we should see next, I think.
It's the painting next.
Oh, it's the painting. Here's the painting of the attack. Yes. This isn't a very good painting. I don't normally like battle.
Too much sky, isn't there? I saw that. I was like, no, they're badly composed. Too much sky.
It is. But it's the only picture we've got of that battle. So I thought I'd sling it in. There it is. It's a bit like Victor Comics, that one, I think. But those supported by tanks, they attacked. And leading the attack is this gentleman.
Oh, hang on. Yep. There we go.
There he is. I don't think he was wearing mess kit when he was leading the attack.
Well, you never know. Eccentric British officers in marking up, but yeah, in this time, but yes, unlikely. Yeah.
He was an extremely eccentric British officer. His name was Willie Hayes, and he won 2 military crosses, one of which he's about to win in this battle. You've met him before because he was on Malta with them, and he was on Sicily with them. He was threatened with court-martial on Sicily because he was asked to attack tanks with his carriers, and he knew that he couldn't do it. But he had a wonderful sense of humour. And in this particular battle, he was knocked sideways by a bursting shell, picked himself up and carried on and captured the objective. He and a fellow company commander, the two attacking companies, took their objectives. But it was a particularly bloody battle, and the Germans fought to the death. here is a description. Now, this guy, Frank Shackle, who I'm going to tell you about now, and we have a picture of him if you like. There he is. Look at that moustache, eh?
Yeah, that's a fantastic moustache, isn't it? Yeah, that compensates for the iffy painting. That does.
It does, doesn't it? You don't often see a moustache like that. Now, he looks like a seasoned officer, doesn't he? But in fact, he's just been commissioned. He's just arrived. Until now, he'd been in the ranks of the Royal Army Service Corps. And he's just joined. This is his first battle, poor devil. Wow. He joins the first Dorsets. And luckily, he's in the reserve company. Well, let's hear from him what happened. No sooner had our company commander gone off to receive orders than the shelling began, and then followed the greatest traumatic experience in my army career. A runner came back through the shell fire to tell us that our very young company commander was killed, and that Colonel Breeden requested the company of the C Company platoon commanders PDQ pretty damn quick. Lieutenant Gilhooly, Sergeant Rowe, MM, and I advanced through shot and shell towards Speedy Breeden. Near him, we saw the body of our company commander, one arm stretched out as if in sleep. Speedy told us to find cover and await orders. He stood, calmly brushing his toothbrush moustache as we three dived into the first unoccupied slit trench we could find. I couldn't get down far enough, so I took off my small pack and placed it at the base of an apple tree just above my head. Suddenly, there was a terrific bang. My tin hat blew onto the bridge of my nose, and I found myself completely deaf and numb down my left side. I was soaked with rum. I opened my eyes and pushed Sergeant Rowe from me to find him dead, with 2 great holes in his back. Lieutenant Gilhooly was in a bad way, groaning with 2 wounds in his stomach, but still alive. He was a Canadian, by the way. Pushing Sergeant Rowe's body forward, I scrambled out of the trench to find the nose cap of an 88mm shell embedded in my small pack. The water bottle containing the platoon's rum ration, my shaving kit and personal belongings were destroyed, and my moustache scissors were ruined. I can so vividly remember the next few minutes. Going up to Speedy Breeden, giving him an excellent salute, saying, "Sir, the rum is external, not internal. My small pack bears witness. Stretcher bearers required urgently. I have to report I am the only officer remaining in C Company. Your orders, please." He gave a rare smile. "We've radioed for stretcher bearers. We'll look after Gilhooly and Rowe. Return to C Company, take command, and hold them in reserve until further orders." And that's what Frank Shackle did. Frank Shackle became a headmaster later in life down here. I think that's a wonderful description.
It's very reminiscent of even your father's writing and other British participants, where within a sentence, the tonal shifts can be so dramatic, but it's a unique way of writing that's sort of generational and also the essence of Britishness. My great uncle in the Royal Ulsters had that way of writing and talking, where he would have you laughing, and then while you're still laughing, he's moving you, and then you feel bad because you're laughing, but then he's brought you back to get laughing again. That ability to just shift the tones is something very, very British, I think. Yeah, extraordinary.
I think so. This is the end of the battle. Willie Hayes and Skinny Law, the 2 assault company commanders, have taken the position, the German positions, and there's no more attempts to attack Nijmegen. There's been a big cost. The first Dorset suffered 90 casualties, 23 of them fatal, and they lost 2 company commanders. Happily, not Willie Hayes and not Skinny Law. It was Frank Shackle's company commander and another one who were killed in that battle. It was their last battle because 50 Div were brought home shortly after this, and they had fought all the way through Malta, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and I should think they'd had their bit.
And that had been planned in advance. That wasn't as a result of anything that happened in Market Garden. That had been kind of on the writing on the wall. Am I correct in that?
Running out of men.
Yeah.
Simple as that. And you couldn't go on reinforcing them. We were running out of men as a country.
Yeah.
If you look at demographically at it, we hadn't got enough men to man our army.
Yeah.
A lot of the officers, for example, were Canadians by now, including Lieutenant Gilhooly.
Yeah, the Canloans, yeah.
They became Canadian Dorsets. How you do that, I don't know, but they did. So this is the temporary cemetery at Bemmel, taken a year later. And of course, very soon afterwards, they would have been turned into war graves and moved to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Now let's look at the losses to the battalions of the Dorset Regiment. The 1st Battalion at Arnhem lost 23. The 4th Battalion lost 17 plus 11 who died as prisoners of war. The 5th Battalion lost 22. And the 94th Field Regiment, also known as the Dorset Yeomanry, lost 6. At the end of it all, as they were helping the Airborne back across the river, an Airborne sergeant said to one of the Dorset soldiers, "Where have you been?" And he replied, "We've been fighting all the way from Normandy." In the late 1980s, my father's platoon sergeant, Jim Kingston, who was a great man, went on a battlefield tour of the Netherlands and heard John Frost being very, very critical of 30 Corps' role and saying that they'd been slow and they hadn't given it their all. Jim Kingston was quite a hierarchical creature. He didn't like criticizing officers. He wanted to put them on a pedestal and follow them, but he wasn't a fool either. And he was intensely loyal to his fellow soldiers. He stood up in the crowded hall and he took John Frost to task and ticked him off and said it wasn't true. What he'd seen was 30 Corps really doing their absolute utmost to get there. Being Jim, of course, he came home and he was very upset about it. And he wrote to my father about it and said, "I've just been nasty to a major general." But this is what he said. So my father wrote to John Frost and explained that Jim was a fantastic man who had given everything he'd got. And he got a very nice letter back from General Frost saying it was very hard when chaps who've given their all, I can remember that expression, chaps who've given their all are criticised. And I think actually it's in that spirit that I'd like to end this talk. It's very easy, particularly 80 years on, to look back at this and think, I'd have done this differently. They shouldn't have done that. And it's interesting to do it. But one of the rules that I try to follow when I'm writing my stuff is to try to be a little bit understanding, because when you're making these decisions, the circumstances are not normal.
Yep.
By the law of averages, you're going to get some of them wrong. And what you don't want is some clever sod sniping at you from the safe distance of 80 years. So I'm not prepared to do it. A lot of people gave a great deal to make Arnhem work. It's incalculably sad that it didn't work, but they did their best, and no one can ask more.
Absolutely, and brilliant sentiment to end in. And just a quick comment from me, reflecting on what I asked you at the beginning, is that with the mood that came out of Market Garden, and all those paratroopers and glider guys going into the bag, along with those that were killed and wounded, pointing out some of the moments that had worked, the moments of bravery. You've talked about the field artillery or the yeomanry, some of the that would have seemed somehow uncouth to say, but this bit worked quite well. There was the mood was not for trying to kind of find little bits that had gone well, and so I think that's contributed to the focus on the Airborne, is that is where the affection, that is where the kind of the instant sympathy went, understandably, and it meant that some of these other I don't want to use the word bright spot, but moments of incredible bravery. And as you said, there, people getting on with their job and doing their stuff, kind of got not pushed aside, but deliberately left in the background because it was the right thing to do at the time.
I think that's right. I took my dad to see A Bridge Too Far when it came out, and he didn't like it at all. But when he looked at when he saw the bits with Edward Fox as Horrocks and with Michael Caine as Joe Vandeleur, he thought, and I remember his exact words, he said they captured the bank holiday spirit of that advance. The tails were up. They wanted to succeed, and the ones I've met, they seem to me to have done their best. Yeah,
no, I think that with all the obvious criticisms and analysis of the plan, I think we should always remember, as you said there, to not criticize the men, the blokes, and the Dutch civilians, of course, who had to endure what they did for as you made the point, months longer than they perhaps would have done had this worked. Is that, yeah, I think once you've kind of got a certain number of pips and brass on your shoulders, you're kind of open for criticism. I think we all think it's okay to start not criticizing, but analyzing the decisions made by colonels and above. But the blokes, just the blokes, platoon commanders and under, they're just doing their job and they're doing their best. And you've admirably shared some of their stories. So we will leave things there, Christopher, but I've made a mental note to come back and bring you in from Hill 112 because we haven't done anything Hill 112. It's come up. Of course, it's come up in passing, but we've not done a dedicated Hill 112 show. So maybe next June, if not before, if I can think of an infantry week or something, we'll bring you back for that. But folks, as I said earlier, I'm back tomorrow evening, UK time, with John to talk about the medics at Arnhem, and then it's Al Murray on Thursday and the traitor of Arnhem on Friday, and then there's more stuff. I might squeeze another show in Thursday evening, haven't decided yet. But thank you very much, Christopher. Thank you, everybody, for your fantastic views and comments and questions. And I will see you all next time. Cheers, everybody. Thanks very much. Bye.